Marcus Chen had always been different from the other cadets at the Galactic Military Academy. While his classmates came from peaceful garden worlds where the biggest threat was a thunderstorm, Marcus grew up on Kepler 442b, a planet the military officially classified as a high-risk survival zone, but everyone else simply called a death world. The shuttle carrying the new batch of cadets descended through Earth's atmosphere, and Marcus pressed his face against the small window. Below stretched endless green forests and blue oceans, nothing like the crimson wasteland and acid rain of his home planet. The other cadets chattered excitedly about finally reaching the academy, but Marcus remained silent, watching this alien paradise unfold beneath them. "First time off-world?" asked the cadet sitting next to him. The boy had soft features and pale skin that had never seen real sunlight. His uniform was perfectly pressed and his hands showed no calluses or scars. Everything about him screamed safe world citizen. Marcus nodded but didn't elaborate. How could he explain that on his planet, children learned to identify the sound of approaching deathstalkers before they could properly walk? That his morning routine included checking for acid burns on his protective gear and scanning the horizon for the telltale shimmer that meant a predator was using its natural camouflage? The academy sprawled across several kilometers of manicured grounds. Perfectly trimmed grass, decorative fountains, and students walking leisurely between buildings. It looked more like a resort than a military training facility. Marcus had expected something harsher, more practical. On Kepler 442b, any building that wasn't reinforced steel and composite armor became a tomb within hours. During orientation, Admiral Richardson addressed the new cadets in a grand auditorium with crystal chandeliers and velvet seats. The man spoke about honor, duty, and the noble tradition of protecting humanity's expanding frontier. Marcus listened politely, but his attention kept drifting to the windows. They were made of regular glass, not the thick polymer barriers necessary for survival on his world. A single crack here would mean nothing more than a repair bill. Back home, it would mean death for everyone inside. The galaxy is vast and often dangerous, the Admiral continued, but with proper training and teamwork, you will learn to face any challenge the universe presents. Marcus almost smiled at that. The Admiral had clearly never faced a pack of razor wolves during a methane storm, or tried to navigate through a forest where the trees themselves were carnivorous. These cadets would learn about danger from textbooks and simulations. He had learned by watching friends disappear in the night and never come back. After the ceremony, cadets were assigned to dormitories and given their first week's schedule. Marcus found his room on the 3rd floor, a spacious area with 2 beds, personal storage units, and another of those fragile windows. His roommate, David Kim, was already unpacking when Marcus arrived. "Hey there," David greeted him with an enthusiastic wave. "I'm from New Geneva Colony. Beautiful place, really. We have these amazing crystal formations that sing in the wind. Where are you from?" "Kepler 442b, Marcus replied, setting down his single bag. David's face went blank for a moment, then his eyes widened. "Wait, that's one of those death worlds, isn't it? I read about them in xenobiology class. How did you even survive there?" "Carefully," Marcus said, beginning to unpack his few belongings. Everything he owned fit in one small bag because, on his planet, possessions were luxuries that could get you killed if they slowed you down. David watched in fascination as Marcus removed items that looked nothing like standard civilian gear. A knife with a serrated edge designed for cutting through acidic plant matter, a compact scanner that could detect biological signatures through most forms of natural camouflage, clothing made from materials that could resist both extreme heat and corrosive substances. "Is that stuff even legal here?" David asked, pointing at the knife. "It's standard survival equipment where I come from," Marcus explained. "On Kepler 442b, you carry this or you die, usually within the first hour of leaving a secure facility." The next morning brought their first combat simulation exercise. The other cadets filed into the virtual reality chambers, chattering about tactics they had studied and strategies they had memorized from military history texts. Marcus followed silently, observing how they moved. Their steps were too heavy, too predictable. They talked too loudly and paid no attention to their surroundings beyond what was directly in front of them. The simulation began in a dense jungle environment designed to test basic survival and combat skills. Most cadets immediately began searching for weapons caches and strategic positions they had read about in their manuals. Marcus crouched low and remained perfectly still, listening and watching. The artificial jungle was impressive by most standards, but compared to the living nightmare forests of his homeworld, it felt almost quaint. The predators moved in predictable patterns, their attack algorithms following standard programming that any Deathworld survivor could read like a children's book, while his teammates charged through the undergrowth making noise and leaving obvious tracks. Marcus moved like a shadow. Every step was placed with deliberate care, every movement calculated to avoid detection. He had learned this not from instructors or simulations, but from necessity. On Kepler 442b, the creatures that hunted humans had evolved for millions of years to be perfect killing machines. Survival meant becoming something even more dangerous. The first enemy contact came when a simulated alien warrior dropped from the canopy onto David's position. The boy screamed and tried to flee, but the creature was faster. In a real Deathworld scenario, David would have been dead before his brain could process what was happening. Marcus moved without thinking, his body responding with reflexes honed by years of genuine life-or-death encounters. He struck the creature at precisely the right angle to disrupt its balance, then delivered a killing blow before it could recover. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 seconds. David stared at him in shock. "How did you move so fast? I didn't even see you coming." Marcus helped him to his feet, scanning the canopy for additional threats. "On my world, if you're not fast enough to kill something before it knows you're there, you become food." The simulation continued, but it had become something different now. Instead of a training exercise, it had become a demonstration of what real survival looked like when practiced by someone who had never had the luxury of making mistakes. The virtual jungle simulation had been running for 30 minutes when something unexpected happened. Marcus noticed it first, a subtle change in the ambient sounds that his fellow cadets completely missed. The programmed bird calls had stopped, and the rustle of artificial leaves had taken on a different rhythm. Even in this digital environment, something was triggering his survival instincts. "Everyone stop moving," Marcus whispered to his squad, but they were too busy following their textbook formations to listen. David was consulting his tactical display, trying to match their current position with the predetermined route they had memorized. Sarah Chen, their appointed team leader, was coordinating with other squads through her communication device, completely unaware that her constant chatter was announcing their location to everything within a kilometer radius. Marcus had tried to fit in during his first week at the academy, following the standard procedures and protocols that the instructors emphasized in every class. But those procedures were designed for conflicts between human armies, not for survival against creatures that had evolved to hunt in ways no military manual could anticipate. The attack came from below, as Marcus had expected. The simulation's apex predator, a creature resembling a massive underground worm with crystalline teeth, erupted from beneath the forest floor, directly under Sarah's position. In a real Deathworld encounter, she would have been consumed instantly, her death serving as a warning to others about the dangers of predictable movement patterns. But this was a training exercise, so the creature simply marked her as eliminated and prepared to hunt the remaining squad members. The other cadets scattered in panic, abandoning their formations and running in different directions just as their training manuals specifically warned against doing. Marcus didn't run. On Kepler 442b, running from an underground predator was suicide because their hunting strategy relied on prey fleeing in terror. Instead, he dropped flat against the forest floor and began moving in a pattern that would confuse the creature's seismic sensors. Every movement was deliberate, designed to create false readings that would make the predator think it was tracking multiple smaller prey animals, rather than a single human target. The creature emerged again, this time near David's hiding spot behind a large tree. David screamed and tried to climb higher, but the simulation's physics made that impossible. Marcus watched the boys panic with something approaching sympathy. David had grown up on a world where trees were decorative features in city parks, not potential lifelines or death traps depending on the circumstances. Moving with the fluid precision that only came from years of genuine survival experience, Marcus approached the creature from its blind spot. He had studied the anatomy of similar predators on his homeworld, learning that their heavily armored exterior hid vulnerable nerve clusters that could be exploited if struck with exactly the right force at precisely the correct angle. His attack was swift and decisive. The simulated creature registered massive damage and collapsed, its elimination from the exercise triggering a cascade of environmental changes as the computer adjusted the scenario parameters. "Simulation ended," announced the mechanical voice of the training system. "All remaining cadets report to Debrief Chamber 7 for analysis review." The virtual environment dissolved around them, replaced by the sterile white walls of the simulation facility. Marcus found himself standing in the center of a circle of stares from his fellow cadets, their expressions ranging from amazement to something approaching fear. "That was incredible," David said, his voice still shaky from the adrenaline. "I've never seen anyone move like that." "Where did you learn those techniques?" Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "You learn fast when the alternative is becoming something else's dinner." Instructor Williams, a career military officer who had served in several low-intensity conflicts on civilized worlds, approached with a data tablet displaying the simulation's recorded metrics. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus could see confusion in the man's eyes. "Cadet Chen," the instructor said, using Marcus's last name with the formal tone that indicated either commendation or serious trouble. "Your performance in this exercise was unusual. Your movement patterns don't match any documented military tactics in our database, and your elimination of the apex predator utilized techniques that aren't covered in any of our training manuals." Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. He had simply done what came naturally, applying skills that were as much a part of him as breathing or thinking, explaining that he had learned to fight by watching his older brother get torn apart by a pack of acid spitters. When Marcus was 8 years old, didn't seem appropriate for a military debrief. Furthermore, the instructor continued, consulting his tablet, "Our analysis indicates that you identified the creature's presence approximately 47 seconds before it made its first attack. How did you detect it when our sensors showed no indication of its approach?" The question hung in the air while Marcus tried to find words for knowledge that had never needed to be verbalized. How could he explain that on Kepler 442b, children learned to read the subtle signs of approaching danger before they learned to read books? That the cessation of normal forest sounds was as clear a warning as a fire alarm to anyone who had grown up where silence meant death? "The birds stopped singing," Marcus said finally. "On my world, when the ambient noise changes suddenly, it usually means something bigger and hungrier has entered the area. Prey animals have better hearing than humans, so they always know first when a predator is approaching." The instructor stared at him for a long moment, then made several notes on his tablet. "Interesting. We'll be reviewing the environmental audio data to verify this observation. Class dismissed." As the other cadets filed out of the simulation chamber, Marcus overheard fragments of their conversations. Some were impressed by his performance, others seemed disturbed by the casual efficiency with which he had eliminated the creature. A few were already speculating about whether someone from a death world should be allowed to train alongside cadets from safer environments. David waited for him near the exit, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by something that might have been concern. "Marcus, can I ask you something? That thing you did to kill the creature, have you had to do that before? I mean, for real?" Marcus considered the question carefully. The honest answer was yes, dozens of times, starting when he was barely old enough to hold a weapon, but he could see the innocence in David's eyes, the assumption that violence was something that happened to other people in distant places. It was the look of someone who had never watched his own mother fight off a swarm of bone miners while bleeding from 17 different wounds, knowing that medical help was 3 days away and would probably arrive too late anyway. Sometimes survival requires doing things that people from safe worlds don't like to think about, Marcus said instead. "On Kepler 442b, we don't have the luxury of non-lethal solutions." That evening, Marcus sat alone in his dorm room, while David attended a social gathering in the recreation center. Through the fragile glass window, he could see other cadets laughing and playing games on the manicured academy grounds. They moved with the careless confidence of people who had never needed to check for threats before taking a single step outside their homes. Marcus understood that he was different, but he was beginning to realize that the difference was more significant than he had initially thought. These cadets were training to become soldiers, but they were training for wars fought by rules and conventions that meant nothing to the creatures that had shaped his childhood. They were preparing to face enemies that would announce their presence and fight with honor and tactical predictability. News of Marcus's performance in the simulation spread quickly through the Academy's gossip networks. By the end of his second week, he had acquired a reputation that made other cadets treat him with a mixture of respect and unease. Some sought him out for advice about combat techniques, while others seemed to go out of their way to avoid him entirely. The Academy's social dynamics were as foreign to Marcus as everything else about this civilized world. Cadets formed cliques based on their home planets, academic performance, or shared interests in recreational activities that Marcus found incomprehensible. They organized parties and competitions, complained about cafeteria food that would have been considered a feast on Kepler 442b, and worried about grades in theoretical classes that had little connection to actual survival. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the Academy's chief survival instructor, called Marcus to her office 3 days after the simulation incident. Her quarters were located in the administration building, a structure that impressed Marcus with its complete lack of defensive fortifications. On his homeworld, any building that important would have been surrounded by sensor arrays, automated weapon systems, and at least 3 different types of barrier walls. "Cadet Chen," Captain Rodriguez said as Marcus entered her office, "please have a seat. I've been reviewing your performance records, and I have some questions about your background." Marcus settled into the indicated chair, automatically positioning himself so he could see both the door and the window, while keeping his hands free for rapid movement. Captain Rodriguez noticed his seating choice and made a note on her tablet. "According to your Academy application, you completed your primary education through correspondence courses while living on Kepler 442b. Can you tell me more about your actual day-to-day life there?" The question was harder to answer than Marcus had expected. How could he describe waking every morning to check the atmospheric readings that determined whether it was safe to venture outside? How could he explain the routine of inspecting all equipment for signs of acid corrosion, testing food supplies for contamination, and listening to emergency broadcasts about new predator sightings in the sector? "Most days started with survival checks," Marcus said carefully. "Making sure our shelter's integrity hadn't been compromised during the night, checking local weather patterns for acid storm warnings, and reviewing any security alerts from other settlements in the region." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression intensely focused. "Security alerts? What kind of threats required that level of constant vigilance?" Marcus had never needed to catalog the dangers of his homeworld before. They were simply part of the environment like gravity or atmospheric pressure. But he could see that Captain Rodriguez needed specifics, so he tried to organize his memories into categories that might make sense to someone from a safe world. "Biological threats were the most common," he began. "Kepler 442b evolved several species of pack hunters that specifically target human settlements. Razor wolves travel in groups of 15 to 20 and can chew through standard building materials in under an hour. Bone miners burrow through rock and metal to reach food sources, which includes humans. Acid spitters can dissolve most protective equipment from a distance of up to 50 meters." As Marcus spoke, Captain Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional interest to barely concealed shock. She had clearly read about Deathworlds in academic contexts, but hearing first-hand descriptions from someone who had actually lived in such an environment was different from studying theoretical threat assessments. "Environmental hazards were equally dangerous," Marcus continued. "Atmospheric acid storms could strip flesh from bone in minutes if you were caught outside without proper protection. The soil in most regions contains microorganisms that can infect wounds and cause death within hours, if not treated immediately. Even the plant life is hostile. Most trees and shrubs have developed defensive mechanisms that make them effectively carnivorous." Captain Rodriguez set down her tablet and stared at him for a long moment. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. Most of the cadets in this academy come from worlds where the greatest danger is a traffic accident or a sporting injury. The survival training we provide is designed to prepare them for military operations in civilized space, not for this level of threat." Marcus nodded, unsure what response was expected. He had already realized that his fellow cadets lacked the instincts necessary for genuine survival situations. Their training focused on technological solutions and coordinated tactics that assumed the presence of support systems and backup plans. They had never learned to function with the knowledge that a single mistake meant immediate death with no possibility of rescue or medical intervention. "I'm curious about something else," Captain Rodriguez said, picking up her tablet again. Our psychological evaluation indicates that you show no signs of trauma or stress-related disorders, despite growing up in an environment that would be considered catastrophically dangerous by standard measures. How do you account for that? The question surprised Marcus because he had never considered his upbringing traumatic. Dangerous, certainly, but trauma implied unexpected or abnormal experiences. On Kepler 442b, constant threat was normal. Children learned to cope with it the same way children on other worlds learned to cope with homework or chores. I think people from safe worlds misunderstand what it means to live on a death world, Marcus said slowly, trying to articulate thoughts he had never needed to express before. You assume that constant danger creates fear and anxiety, but it actually creates the opposite. When survival depends on making correct decisions under pressure, you learn to stay calm and think clearly no matter what's happening around you. Captain Rodriguez made more notes, her expression thoughtful. That's a fascinating perspective. Tell me, how do you view your fellow cadets? Do you think they're adequately prepared for military service? Marcus considered the question carefully. His honest assessment would probably be considered insulting, but Captain Rodriguez seemed to want genuine answers rather than diplomatic responses. They're well-educated and physically capable, he said diplomatically, but they've never had to make decisions where failure means death. In the simulation, when David was faced with an immediate threat, he panicked and tried to run. On a real battlefield, that reaction would get him and possibly his entire squad killed. And you think your background gives you an advantage in military training? Marcus shook his head. Not an advantage. Different skills. They know tactics and strategy and military history. I know how to stay alive when everything goes wrong and all your plans fall apart. Both types of knowledge are probably necessary for effective military service. Captain Rodriguez set down her tablet and leaned back in her chair. Marcus, I'm going to be frank with you. Your performance in simulations is causing some concern among the faculty. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're demonstrating capabilities that far exceed what we expect from first-year cadets. Some instructors are questioning whether it's fair to other students to have someone with your background in the same training program. The statement hit Marcus harder than he had expected. He had come to the academy hoping to find a place where his skills would be valued and put to good use. The possibility that those same skills might disqualify him from military service had never occurred to him. I don't want special treatment, Marcus said. I just want to serve. I understand that, and I believe you're sincere. But we need to consider what's best for everyone involved. I'm recommending that you be transferred to an accelerated program designed for cadets with exceptional backgrounds. You'd be training alongside others who come from high-threat environments or have prior combat experience. Marcus felt a wave of relief. There are others like me? Captain Rodriguez smiled for the first time during their conversation. Not exactly like you, but yes. The galaxy is a dangerous place, and not everyone who joins the military comes from safe garden worlds. Tomorrow, you'll begin training with a group that might be better suited to your particular skill set. The accelerated training facility was located in a separate complex on the far side of the academy grounds, hidden behind a forest of native earth trees that Marcus found unnaturally peaceful. No acid rain, no prowling predators, no need to constantly scan for threats. Just ordinary trees growing in ordinary soil under an ordinary sky that wouldn't try to kill him. His new quarters were smaller but more practical than his previous dorm room. The windows were made of reinforced polymer, rather than decorative glass, and the room's layout showed evidence of design by someone who understood the psychological needs of people accustomed to high-threat environments. Multiple exit routes, clear sight lines, and furniture that could serve as defensive barriers if necessary. Marcus's new roommate was already present when he arrived, methodically cleaning a collection of weapons that were definitely not standard academy issue. The young man looked up as Marcus entered, and their eyes met with the instant recognition that occurred between people who had faced genuine danger. Dmitry Volkov, the newcomer said, extending a scarred hand. Asteroid Mining Station Series 7. You must be the Deathworlder everyone's talking about. Marcus shook his hand, noting the calluses and burn marks that told stories of hard labor in hostile environments. Marcus Chen, Kepler 442b, what happened to Series 7? Pirate raid, Dmitry said matter-of-factly. Lost atmospheric integrity during the firefight. Most of the miners didn't make it to the emergency shelters in time. He returned to cleaning his weapons with the mechanical precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. I spent 6 months alone on a damaged station with failing life support before the rescue ships arrived. The casual way Dmitri discussed what must have been a horrific experience reminded Marcus of conversations back home, where people described surviving acid storms or predator attacks with the same emotional tone others might use to discuss weather or sports scores. Extreme adversity created a particular type of person, one who processed trauma differently than people from safer environments. "How many others are in this program?" Marcus asked, setting down his bag and beginning to unpack. 12, including us. There's Jana from the Polar Research Station that got cut off during the Ice Wars. Alex, who survived 3 years as a prisoner of war on Proxima Station. And Keiko, whose entire family died in the atmospheric processor accident on Titan III. Dmitri paused his cleaning routine and looked directly at Marcus. "We're all here because we proved we can function when normal people would break down and die." That evening, Marcus met the rest of his new training cohort in a briefing room that looked more like a military command center than a classroom. The other cadets were older than the standard academy students, their faces bearing the subtle marks that came from extended exposure to stress and danger. They moved with the same cautious awareness that Marcus recognized in himself, constantly monitoring their environment for potential threats. Commander Sarah Mitchell, their new instructor, was a veteran of the Frontier Wars who had lost her left arm during the defense of Colony 7. Her prosthetic replacement was military grade, designed for combat functionality rather than cosmetic appearance. She studied the assembled cadets with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating tools for a specific job. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Mitchell began, "you're here because standard military training wasn't designed for people like you. You've already learned the most important lesson any soldier can master: how to survive when everything goes wrong and there's no one coming to save you." She activated a holographic display showing a star map dotted with red warning symbols. The galaxy's expansion has created dozens of frontier conflicts where conventional military doctrine is inadequate. Pirates using modified mining equipment as weapons, alien creatures that don't follow any tactical manual's assumptions about enemy behavior, hostile environments where a single equipment failure means death for an entire squad. Marcus studied the display, recognizing several systems near his homeworld, where mining expeditions had simply vanished without explanation. The galaxy was far more dangerous than most Academy cadets realized, filled with threats that required unconventional solutions. "Your training will focus on independent operations in high-risk environments," Commander Mitchell continued. "You'll learn to function without support, make critical decisions under extreme pressure, and adapt standard military tactics to situations where the rulebook doesn't apply." Alex Rivera, the former prisoner of war, raised his hand. "Commander, are we being trained for special operations units? Some of you will end up in special operations, others in frontier garrison units, and a few might find yourselves in completely new types of military roles that we're still developing." Commander Mitchell's expression became more serious. "The reality is that human expansion has outpaced our understanding of what we're expanding into. We need soldiers who can handle the unknown." Their first training exercise began immediately after the briefing. Unlike the virtual reality simulations used for standard cadets, this exercise took place in a real environment, an abandoned industrial complex that had been converted into a training facility. The buildings were actual structures with real walls, real doors, and real consequences for careless movement. "Your mission," Commander Mitchell announced, "is to secure this facility and extract intelligence from the central computer core. You have 4 hours to complete the objective. Oh, and one more thing. This exercise includes live ammunition and genuine hazards. Medical teams are standing by, but they won't intervene unless someone is critically injured." Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar anticipation that came with facing real danger. Around him, the other cadets were experiencing similar reactions, their bodies responding to the knowledge that this was no longer a game with reset buttons and do-overs. The facility was a maze of interconnected buildings, maintenance tunnels, and industrial equipment that created countless opportunities for ambush or tactical error. Unlike the carefully balanced scenarios used in standard training, this environment was chaotic and unpredictable, filled with hazards that had no connection to military objectives. Marcus moved through the complex with the fluid stealth that had kept him alive on Kepler 442b. But now he was working as part of a team rather than operating alone. Jana proved to be an expert at reading structural integrity, identifying load-bearing walls and potential collapse points that could be used tactically. Dimitri's experience with industrial equipment allowed him to recognize which machinery might still be functional and potentially useful. The exercise quickly became a demonstration of how people with survival backgrounds approached problems differently than conventionally trained soldiers. Instead of following predetermined assault patterns, they adapted to the environment itself, using its unique characteristics to achieve their objectives. When they encountered the first defensive position, fortified checkpoint manned by training instructors, using non-lethal but painful stun weapons, Marcus's team didn't attempt a frontal assault or try to outflank the position using standard military tactics. Instead, they treated it like an environmental hazard to be avoided rather than an enemy to be defeated. Keiko used her knowledge of atmospheric systems to identify ventilation shafts that bypassed the checkpoint entirely. Alex applied his understanding of psychological warfare to create distractions that drew the defenders' attention away from their actual route. Marcus provided overwatch, using his enhanced threat detection abilities to ensure they weren't walking into secondary ambushes. They completed the exercise in less than half the allotted time, achieving their objective without firing a single shot or engaging any of the defensive positions directly. When they emerged from the facility, Commander Mitchell was waiting with a timer and an expression of satisfied approval. "Congratulations," she said. "You've just demonstrated why conventional military thinking isn't always the best solution. Standard assault tactics would have taken 6 hours and resulted in significant casualties. You found a third option that achieved the mission with 0 losses and minimal resource expenditure." As they walked back to the debriefing area, Marcus realized that for the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he was in the right place. These people understood the difference between surviving and merely following orders. They knew that the best victory was often the one where you never had to fight at all. 3 months into the accelerated program, Marcus received news that changed everything. A priority communication from the Frontier Defense Command arrived with his name specifically listed in the recipient field, something that had never happened to a cadet in the Academy's history. Commander Mitchell called him to her office immediately after the message arrived. Her expression was unreadable, but Marcus could see tension in the way she held her shoulders and the careful precision with which she moved. These were signs he had learned to recognize in people who were preparing to deliver difficult news. "Marcus, how much do you know about the situation on the Outer Rim worlds?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit down across from her desk. "Just what we've covered in strategic studies classes," Marcus replied. "There have been some unexplained losses of contact with frontier settlements, and several mining operations have gone silent without sending distress signals." Commander Mitchell activated her desk display, showing a 3-dimensional star map with dozens of red markers indicating lost colonies and missing expeditions. The pattern was disturbing. Entire systems going dark with no evidence of attack or natural disaster. "The situation is worse than what we've been telling the standard cadets," she said. "In the past 6 months, we've lost contact with 47 frontier installations. No distress signals, no survivors, no wreckage, nothing. Just complete silence where there used to be thriving human settlements." Marcus studied the display, noting that many of the missing colonies were located near systems similar to his homeworld.
"Have there been any investigation teams sent to determine what happened?"
17 investigation teams have been dispatched. None have returned. Commander Mitchell's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. The most recent team included a full military expedition with advanced surveillance equipment and a battalion of experienced frontier troops. They reached the target system and began transmitting regular reports, then suddenly went completely silent. The implications were staggering. If experienced military units were vanishing without trace, whatever was happening on the frontier represented a threat level beyond anything the galaxy had previously encountered. 3 days ago, Commander Mitchell continued, Frontier Command received a partial transmission from Deep Space Monitoring Station Omega-7. The message was heavily corrupted, but our cryptographers have managed to reconstruct fragments of it. She played an audio recording that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. The voice belonged to someone clearly in extreme distress, speaking in broken sentences punctuated by sounds that Marcus's Deathworld-trained ears recognized as the approach of something very large and very hostile. Not weapons, not technology, something else entirely. They just walk, everything goes silent. Apex predators fleeing in terror. Even the machine stopped working when the transmission ended in static, followed by the automated signal that indicated complete loss of contact with the monitoring station. Marcus, Commander Mitchell said, leaning forward with an intensity that demanded his complete attention, Frontier Command has requested that you be assigned to a special investigation team. They specifically asked for someone with Deathworld survival experience, and your name was the only one that met their criteria. Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride that his skills were being recognized at the highest levels, concern about what kind of threat could make apex predators flee in terror, and a deep sense of responsibility to help solve a mystery that was threatening human expansion across the galaxy. What would my role be on this investigation team? Marcus asked. Survival consultant and threat assessment specialist. The team will include xenobiologists, military tacticians, and advanced technology specialists. But they need someone who can recognize danger patterns that might not be obvious to people from safer backgrounds. Marcus nodded slowly. When do we leave? That's the complication. You're still technically a cadet, and Academy regulations don't allow active duty assignments until after graduation. However, Frontier Command has indicated that they consider this situation urgent enough to warrant special exceptions. Commander Mitchell pulled up another display, showing personnel files for the proposed investigation team. Marcus recognized several names from military history texts, highly decorated officers and renowned specialists in their respective fields. The team will be led by Colonel James Harrison, a veteran of the Proxima conflicts who has extensive experience with unconventional threats. Dr. Lisa Park will serve as xenobiologist and environmental specialist. Major Tom Bradley will handle tactical coordination and military strategy, and you would fill the role of survival and threat detection specialist. Marcus studied the files, noting that all of these people had achieved ranks and recognition that typically required decades of service. The fact that he was being considered for assignment alongside such experienced personnel was both honored and intimidating. There's one more thing you need to know, Commander Mitchell said, her voice becoming even more serious. The investigation will take place on Kepler 438b, a planet located in the same stellar region as your homeworld. Environmental conditions are similar to what you grew up with, which is another reason Frontier Command specifically requested you. The mention of Kepler 438b triggered memories that Marcus had tried to suppress. 2 years before he left for the Academy, a geological survey team had vanished on that planet under circumstances that were never fully explained. Search and rescue operations had found their equipment scattered across several kilometers of terrain, but no bodies and no indication of what had happened to the 12-person expedition. I accept the assignment, Marcus said without hesitation. When do we depart? Commander Mitchell smiled grimly. The transport ship leaves in 72 hours. You'll need to complete accelerated certification in 3 specialized areas before departure: xenobiology threat assessment, advanced survival techniques, and emergency command protocols. The next 3 days blurred together in an intensive training regimen that pushed Marcus beyond anything he had experienced even on his homeworld. The xenobiology certification required him to learn identification and response procedures for hundreds of potentially hostile alien species. Advanced survival techniques covered scenarios that went far beyond basic environmental hazards, including situations where standard equipment failed completely and improvisation became the only option for staying alive. Emergency command protocols were the most challenging aspect of his preparation. Marcus had always operated as an individual survivor, making decisions that affected only himself. Now he needed to learn how to make choices that could determine the survival of an entire team, including people whose backgrounds and capabilities were very different from his own. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Academy's leading expert on frontier operations, conducted his final certification exam personally. She presented him with a series of hypothetical scenarios that combined multiple threat types, equipment failures, and team management challenges. Scenario 17, Dr. Vasquez announced. Your team is stranded on a hostile planet after your transport ship suffers catastrophic failure. You have limited supplies, no communication with command, and sensor readings indicate the presence of multiple unknown life forms converging on your position. One team member is injured and cannot move without assistance. Another team member is experiencing psychological breakdown due to stress. What are your immediate priorities? Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the scenario and considering all the variables involved. This was exactly the type of situation where his Deathworld experience would be most valuable, but he also needed to apply the leadership principles he had learned during his accelerated training. First, priority is establishing a secure defensive position that provides protection from multiple approach vectors while allowing for potential evacuation routes, he began. Second priority is addressing the injured team members' medical needs while ensuring their condition doesn't compromise overall team security. Third priority is psychological stabilization of the affected team member through task assignment and clear communication of survival plans. Dr. Vasquez made notes on her evaluation tablet, then presented him with follow-up questions that tested his ability to adapt his initial plan as circumstances changed. By the end of the exam, Marcus felt mentally exhausted but confident that he had demonstrated the competencies necessary for his new assignment. "Congratulations, Marcus," Dr. Vasquez said as she completed her evaluation. "You've achieved certification scores that exceed the requirements for your assigned role. Frontier Command made an excellent choice in requesting you for this mission." That evening, Marcus packed his gear for the journey to Kepler 438b. His equipment list included items that were familiar from his childhood, alongside advanced military technology he was still learning to use. As he prepared for departure, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they found on Kepler 438b would change his understanding of what was possible in the galaxy. The journey to Kepler 438b aboard the military transport ship Meridian took 8 days through hyperspace, during which Marcus had the opportunity to work closely with his new team members. Colonel Harrison proved to be a methodical leader who listened carefully to input from specialists before making decisions. Dr. Park possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of xenobiology that impressed even Marcus, who had grown up surrounded by hostile alien life forms. Major Bradley approached tactical problems with a creativity that reminded Marcus of his own unconventional thinking. Despite their individual expertise, Marcus quickly realized that none of them had ever faced the type of comprehensive environmental threat that defined Deathworld existence. Their knowledge was specialized and academic, based on controlled studies and documented encounters, rather than the intuitive understanding that came from living constantly on the edge of survival. "Marcus," Dr. Park said during one of their planning sessions, "I've been reviewing the environmental data from Kepler 438b, and I'm having trouble understanding how indigenous life forms could pose a threat significant enough to make experienced military units simply vanish. The ecosystem appears to follow standard evolutionary patterns." Marcus looked at the biological survey data displayed on Dr. Park's tablet, noting immediately that the scientific classifications missed several crucial details that would be obvious to anyone with Deathworld experience. "Dr. Park, these survey reports were compiled from orbital scans and brief surface expeditions, correct?" Marcus asked. "Yes, standard protocol for preliminary biological assessment." "Why do you ask?" Marcus pointed to a section of the data that showed what appeared to be a normal predator-prey relationship between several species. This analysis assumes that the largest creatures in each environmental niche represent the apex predators. But that's not necessarily true on worlds with extreme evolutionary pressure. He pulled up additional data on his own tablet, showing atmospheric composition and geological activity patterns. Kepler 438b has unusually high levels of rare earth minerals and atmospheric electrical activity. On my homeworld, similar conditions led to the evolution of creatures that don't fit standard biological categories. Colonel Harrison leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean by creatures that don't fit standard categories?" Marcus had never needed to explain this concept to people who hadn't grown up around such life forms. How could he describe creatures that existed at the intersection of biological and technological evolution, organisms that had adapted to extreme environments by developing capabilities that seemed almost supernatural? On Kepler 442b, the highest-level predators aren't necessarily the biggest or strongest creatures, Marcus began carefully. Extreme environmental pressure can drive evolution in directions that standard xenobiology doesn't anticipate. Some creatures develop electromagnetic manipulation abilities. Others achieve states that blur the line between individual organisms and collective consciousness. Dr. Park's expression shifted from scientific skepticism to genuine concern. Are you suggesting that the life forms on Kepler 438b might possess capabilities beyond what our threat assessment models can predict? I'm suggesting that if entire military units are vanishing without trace, we're probably dealing with something that operates according to rules we don't understand yet. Major Bradley pulled up tactical analysis files on his workstation. Marcus, from a military perspective, what would it take to make an entire battalion disappear without any distress signals or evidence of combat? Marcus considered the question seriously. On his homeworld, he had witnessed creatures that could disable electronic equipment through natural electromagnetic pulses, others that could induce psychological effects resembling mass hypnosis, and a few that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time in ways that made them effectively undetectable until they chose to manifest. There are several possibilities, Marcus said slowly. Electronic disruption that prevents communication and disables weapon systems. Psychological manipulation that causes troops to abandon their positions voluntarily. Environmental hazards that eliminate physical evidence of what happened, or something we haven't encountered before. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement from the ship's communication system. All personnel report to stations. We're approaching the Kepler 438 system and beginning final approach to planetary orbit. Through the ship's observation deck, Marcus got his first view of Kepler 438b. The planet was strikingly similar to his homeworld, with the same reddish atmospheric tinge and swirling storm patterns that indicated high levels of chemical activity in the upper atmosphere. Orbital scans showed a surface marked by dramatic geological formations and vast areas of what appeared to be crystalline growth structures. Initial sensor sweeps are detecting multiple artificial structures on the planet's surface, reported the ship's science officer. These appear to be the remains of human settlements and military installations. Colonel Harrison studied the sensor data with growing concern. Are there any signs of current human activity? Any indication that survivors might still be present? Negative, sir. All artificial structures appear to be abandoned, and we're detecting no electromagnetic signatures consistent with active human technology. Marcus felt a familiar chill as he recognized the implications. On his homeworld, abandoned settlements were always dangerous places, not because of what remained, but because of what had claimed them. Whatever had driven humans away from these installations was probably still present. Colonel, Marcus said, I recommend we establish our base camp at least 50 kilometers away from any of the abandoned settlements. If something forced those people to leave, approaching their former positions could trigger a similar response. Colonel Harrison nodded, making notes on his tactical display. Agreed. We'll set up our primary camp in an area with good visibility and multiple evacuation routes. Dr. Park, I want continuous monitoring of all biological activity within a 20-kilometer radius. Major Bradley, establish defensive perimeters and maintain constant communication with the ship. The landing itself proceeded smoothly, but Marcus noticed immediately that something was wrong with the planet's ecosystem. As their transport descended through the atmosphere, he observed vast areas of landscape where normal biological activity seemed to be completely absent. No movement, no vegetation, no signs of the complex predator-prey relationships that should have been evident even from orbital altitude. When they touched down and began unloading equipment, the silence was the most disturbing aspect of their new environment. Marcus had grown up on a world where silence meant imminent danger, and Kepler 438b was quieter than any natural environment he had ever experienced. Dr. Park, Marcus said as they established their initial perimeter, are your sensors detecting any biological activity in our immediate area? Dr. Park consulted her equipment with a puzzled expression. This is strange. I'm reading atmospheric composition and geological activity consistent with a thriving ecosystem, but actual biological signatures are almost non-existent. It's as if all the life forms in this region have simply left. Marcus felt his survival instincts activate with an intensity he hadn't experienced since leaving his homeworld. Whatever had caused the abandonment of human settlements on Kepler 438b was still active, and they had just announced their presence by landing a spaceship and setting up technological equipment that would be visible from considerable distances. Colonel, Marcus said, his voice carrying the urgent tone that people from Deathworlds learned to recognize as a warning of immediate danger. We need to accelerate our investigation timeline. Something about this environment suggests we may not have as much time as we originally planned. Colonel Harrison looked around at the eerily quiet landscape and seemed to reach the same conclusion. Agreed. We begin reconnaissance operations immediately. I want answers about what happened here, and I want them before whatever caused it decides to pay us a visit. As they prepared to venture beyond their landing site, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed by something that existed just beyond the range of their detection equipment. On his homeworld, that feeling had always been accurate, and it had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters. The investigation of Kepler 438b was about to reveal whether the galaxy contained threats that even Deathworld survivors had never imagined. The first abandoned settlement they investigated told a story that defied conventional explanation. Colonial Administration Outpost Delta 7 had been a thriving community of 300 people just 6 months earlier, according to their last official transmission. Now it stood completely empty, with no signs of struggle, forced evacuation, or natural disaster. Marcus walked through the settlement's main street while his teammates conducted technical analysis of the abandoned buildings. What disturbed him most was not what he found, but what he didn't find. There were no scavenger marks on discarded food, no insect activity around organic waste, no evidence of the natural reclamation processes that should have begun within weeks of human abandonment. Dr. Park, Marcus called to the xenobiologist, who was scanning one of the residential buildings with her equipment. Have you detected any microorganisms in the soil samples? Dr. Park looked up from her scanner with an expression of scientific bewilderment. That's what's so puzzling. I'm detecting trace amounts of microbial activity, but the levels are far below what should be present in a healthy ecosystem. It's as if something has systematically reduced biological activity across the entire region. Marcus knelt and examined the ground more closely, using skills his father had taught him for reading environmental signs that technological equipment might miss. The soil composition was correct for supporting plant life. The atmospheric readings were within normal parameters, but something fundamental was missing from the ecosystem's balance. Colonel Harrison, Marcus said into his communication device, I think we need to expand our search radius. Whatever happened here affected a much larger area than just this settlement. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled back through the communicator. Explain your reasoning, Marcus. On my homeworld, when apex predators abandoned a territory, it usually meant something even more dangerous had claimed that area. But here, it's not just apex predators, it's everything. Insects, microorganisms, scavengers, even plant growth seems to have been affected. Major Bradley emerged from one of the abandoned buildings carrying a tablet displaying architectural schematics. Marcus, take a look at this. The settlement's defensive systems were never activated. No weapons were discharged. No emergency protocols were initiated. According to the computer logs, the last residents simply walked away from their homes and never came back. The implications sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the planet's atmospheric temperature. In his experience, mass abandonment without signs of coercion meant psychological manipulation on a scale that suggested intelligence, far beyond anything they had encountered before. We need to examine one of the military installations, Marcus said. If trained soldiers abandoned their positions without following evacuation protocols, we're dealing with something that can override basic survival instincts. Their next destination was Forward Operating Base Gamma, a military installation that had housed 200 frontier troops and support personnel. The base's defensive perimeters were intact, automated systems were still functional, and equipment stores remained fully stocked. But like the civilian settlement, it was completely devoid of human presence. Marcus examined the base's command center while Dr. Park analyzed biological samples from the surrounding area. The computer systems contained detailed logs right up until the moment when all activity simply stopped. No gradual decline, no emergency entries, just normal daily operations followed by absolute silence, Colonel, Marcus said, studying the final log entries. According to these records, the base personnel completed their normal duty shifts, filed standard reports, and then nothing. The last entry was submitted at 1847 local time, and then no one ever logged into the system again. Colonel Harrison joined him at the command terminal, scrolling through the final days of base activity. This doesn't make sense from a military perspective. Even if they received evacuation orders, There would be records of the order, preparation procedures, and transport coordination. There's no indication that anyone even attempted to leave. Dr. Park's voice interrupted their analysis through the communication system. Colonel Marcus, you need to see what I've found outside the perimeter. They joined Dr. Park at the base's eastern boundary, where she had discovered something that made Marcus's survival instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite articulate. A perfect circle of dead vegetation extended from the base's perimeter fence outward for approximately 50 meters. Beyond that circle, plant life resumed its normal growth patterns as if nothing unusual had occurred. The vegetation didn't die from disease. Environmental contamination or insect damage, Dr. Park explained, showing them her scanner readings. Cellular analysis indicates that the plant simply stopped living. All biological processes ceased simultaneously across this entire area. Marcus walked to the edge of the dead zone and crouched down to examine the boundary line. The transition from dead to living vegetation was so precise it looked artificial, as if someone had drawn a circle and declared that nothing within it would be allowed to exist. Dr. Park, Marcus said slowly, have you ever seen anything like this in your xenobiology studies? Never this level of precise biological. Control suggests intelligence and technological capability far beyond anything in our databases. Dr. Park's voice carried a note of fear that Marcus had not heard from her before. Whatever did this understands life processes well enough to selectively terminate them across a wide area. Marcus stood up and looked back at the abandoned military base, understanding finally beginning to form in his mind. It's not hunting, he said quietly. Whatever we're dealing with isn't hunting humans for food or territory. It's collecting them. Colonel Harrison turned to face him with an expression of grim attention. Explain. On my homeworld, apex predators leave signs of their presence. Kill sites, territorial markers, evidence of consumption. But here, humans and all supporting biological systems have been removed cleanly, efficiently, without waste or struggle. Marcus paused, organizing thoughts that were difficult to express. This suggests intelligence that views humans as specimens rather than prey, the communication device attached to. Colonel Harrison's uniform suddenly activated with an incoming transmission from their ship in orbit. Ground team, this is Meridian Actual. We're detecting unusual energy readings from your location. Recommend immediate evacuation to orbital position. Marcus felt every survival instinct he possessed activate simultaneously. On Kepler 442b, sudden changes in energy patterns usually preceded the arrival of something large, hostile and impossible to fight using conventional methods. Colonel, Marcus said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that came from a lifetime of reading deadly signs. We need to leave this planet now. Whatever created these dead zones is aware of our presence, and it's coming. As if summoned by his words, the perfectly clear sky above them began to shimmer with distortions that looked like heat mirages but moved with deliberate purpose. Dr. Park's scanning equipment registered energy levels that climbed rapidly beyond the capacity of her instruments to measure. All personnel returned to landing craft immediately, Colonel Harrison ordered. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect. They ran toward their transport ship with Marcus leading the way, his Deathworld-trained senses guiding them along the safest route through terrain that was becoming increasingly unstable. Behind them, the shimmering distortions in the sky were coalescing into something that Marcus's eyes couldn't quite focus on. Something that existed at the edges of perception and seemed to bend space around itself. As their ship lifted off from Kepler 438b and accelerated toward the safety of hyperspace, Marcus looked down at the planet's surface one final time. The dead zones around human settlements were expanding, growing larger with each passing moment as something incomprehensible reclaimed territory that humans had briefly thought they could colonize. Marcus, Colonel Harrison said as they reached safe distance from the planet. In your assessment, what are we dealing with down there? Marcus considered everything they had observed, comparing it to the most dangerous encounters from his Deathworld childhood. Something that makes apex predators look like harmless insects, Colonel. Something that collects civilizations the way a scientist might collect specimens. The galaxy, Marcus realized, was far more dangerous than even Deathworld survivors had imagined. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, an intelligence beyond human comprehension was studying the specimens it had gathered. learning everything it needed to know about the species that called itself the dominant force in the universe. The true test of human survival was just beginning, and Marcus understood that his Deathworld training had prepared him not for the end of danger, but for the recognition that some threats were so vast that the only victory lay in learning to run fast enough to warn others of what was coming. In the depths of space, something noticed their escape and filed the information away for future reference. The collection would continue, but now it would proceed with the knowledge that some specimens were more observant than others. Marcus,